The smell of my mother's famous pot roast filled the suburban Denver home where I grew up, but it couldn't mask the tension that always seemed to follow me into family gatherings. I sat at the far end of the mahogany dining table, the same seat I'd occupied since childhood, the one that somehow felt like exile even in my own family home. So, Marcus is finally getting that promotion to senior partner, my father announced, raising his wine glass toward my older brother. 28 years old, and already making more than most people see in a lifetime. Marcus straightened his Brooks Brothers tie and smiled that practice smile he perfected since law school. It's been a long road, Dad, but worth every late night. And Sarah, my mother chimed in, beaming at my sister across from me. Tell everyone about the new hospital wing you're designing. Sarah, ever the accomplished architect, launched into details about her latest project, a pediatric cancer center that would apparently revolutionize children's health care in Colorado. The family hung on every word, asking thoughtful questions and offering enthusiastic praise. I pushed the mashed potatoes around my plate, knowing what was coming next. The inevitable comparison. The moment when all eyes would turn to me with that mixture of disappointment and barely concealed embarrassment that had defined family dinners for the past 6 years. "And what about you, Daniel?" my Aunt Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she already regretted the question. "Still doing that computer thing?" The table fell silent, except for the gentle clink of silverware against china. I could feel my brother's fiancée, Emma, watching me with curious eyes. She was new to these family dynamics, having only met everyone a few months ago when Marcus brought her home from New York. "I'm still working in tech, yes," I replied quietly, knowing that any attempt to explain would only invite more questions I wasn't ready to answer. "Working in tech," my father repeated with the same tone he might use to say, "living in a cardboard box." "Daniel, you're 26 years old. When are you going to get serious about your career? Your siblings have real jobs, real futures." I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks. 6 years of this. 6 years since I dropped out of business school to pursue what my family called playing around with computers. 6 years of being the cautionary tale, the example of wasted potential. "Dad, with respect, you don't really understand what I do," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I understand that you live in a studio apartment in Austin and drive a car that's older than your nephew," he shot back. "I understand that while your brother is buying a house in Manhattan and your sister is changing lives through her work, you're, what? Making websites." Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. Even he seemed to recognize that Dad was going too far. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Emma shifted in her seat, and I caught her studying me with those intelligent green eyes. There was something different in her expression. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of puzzled curiosity that I couldn't quite read. "Actually," she said softly, "I've been wondering about that. What exactly do you do in tech, Daniel?" The question caught me off guard. No one in my family had ever asked for specifics. They'd written me off as a failure, so completely that the details didn't matter to them. "I work with startups," I said carefully. "I help early-stage companies get off the ground." "Like an advisor?" she pressed gently. I hesitated, glancing around the table at faces that ranged from mildly interested to openly skeptical. "Something like that." My mother sighed dramatically. "Daniel's always been a dreamer. Remember when he wanted to be an astronaut, then a marine biologist? Now it's this computer phase. We keep hoping he'll find something stable." The word phase hit me like a physical blow. 6 years of building something real, something that mattered, dismissed as a phase. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I should go. Early morning tomorrow." As I gathered my jacket, I heard my father mutter to my uncle about tough love and reality checks. I'd heard it all before, but as I headed for the door, I caught Emma's eyes one more time. She was still watching me with that same puzzled expression, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. If only she knew how right her instincts were. The Denver airport at 6 a.m. was a special kind of purgatory. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while travelers shuffled through security lines like zombies in business casual. I sat in the departure lounge, sipping overpriced coffee and trying to shake off the lingering sting from last night's family dinner. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant back in Austin. Reminder, TechCrunch interview at 2 p.m. Also, the Forbes photographer wants to reschedule for Thursday. I quickly deleted the message and glanced around nervously, a habit I developed over the years. Living a double life made you paranoid about the strangest things. Here I was, worried that somehow my family might see a text message about a Forbes interview, as if they might materialize behind me in the airport. The truth was, I'd become an expert at compartmentalizing. In Austin, I was Daniel Chun, the angel investor who'd backed 3 unicorn startups in the past 4 years. I was the guy who wrote 7-figure checks before most people finished their morning coffee. I was a mystery investor that TechCrunch kept trying to profile, the one who preferred to stay out of the spotlight while my portfolio companies went public and made headlines. But in Denver, I was still Danny, the family disappointment who played around with computers. The flight to Austin gave me 2 hours to transition between worlds. By the time we touched down at Austin Bergstrom, I was already mentally reviewing my schedule, a pitch meeting with a promising AI startup at 10, lunch with my portfolio company CEOs at noon, then the TechCrunch interview that would hopefully position me as someone worth paying attention to in the venture capital world. My Uber driver didn't recognize me, which was exactly how I liked it. The beauty of being an investor rather than a founder was that you could build a massive influence while remaining relatively anonymous. I'd learned early on that the real power in Silicon Valley wasn't in being famous. It was in being the person who made other people famous. Nice area, the driver commented as we pulled up to my building in the Seahome district. The sleek glass tower rose 30 stories above Lady Bird Lake, and my penthouse offered views that stretched across the Austin skyline. It was the kind of place that appeared in Architectural Digest, though I'd turned down 3 requests for photo shoots. Yeah, it's quiet, I replied, which was both true and laughably understated. My assistant, Jennifer, met me in the lobby with her usual armload of contracts, NDAs, and due diligence reports. She was a Stanford MBA who could have been making twice her salary at Goldman Sachs, but she'd chosen to work with me because, as she put it, you find the companies that change everything. The Meridian AI team is already upstairs, she said as we rode the elevator to my office on the top floor. Their pitch deck is solid, but I have concerns about their burn rate. Revenue projections? Conservative. Maybe too conservative. They're either being realistic, or they don't understand their own market potential. This was the world where I belonged, where my opinions mattered, where CEOs flew in from San Francisco just to get 15 minutes of my time, where the checks I wrote could turn college dropouts into billionaires. The Meridian AI meeting went well. 3 young founders who built a machine learning platform that could predict market trends with 94% accuracy. The kind of company that would either revolutionize financial services or crash spectacularly trying. Exactly my type of investment. We're looking for someone who understands a long-term vision. Their CEO said, a 24-year-old named Kevin who reminded me of myself 6 years ago, brilliant, driven, and completely dismissed by everyone who should have been taking him seriously. I understand the vision, I said, sliding a term sheet across my glass conference table. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? Their eyes widened as they read the numbers. $7 million for a 12% stake. It was more than they'd asked for and less equity than they'd expected to give up. You'd really invest this much based on one pitch? Kevin asked. I smiled, remembering all the investors who'd passed on my early pitches, who'd called my ideas interesting but not practical. I invest in people who see something others don't. You see the future of financial prediction. I see the future of financial decision-making. As they left with handshakes and promises to have their lawyers review the paperwork, I felt that familiar rush. This was what I lived for. The moment when potential became reality, when someone's crazy idea became the foundation of an empire. But even as I celebrated another successful deal, I couldn't shake the memory of last night's dinner. Emma's curious expression. My father's dismissive tone. The way my own family looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. I walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over Austin's skyline, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere out there, in co-working spaces and garage labs, were the next generation of founders building the companies that would define the next decade. And tomorrow, my family would still think I was wasting my life, play around with computers. The irony was almost funny. Almost. 3 weeks after the family dinner, I was deep into due diligence on a biotech startup when my phone rang with Marcus's number. We hadn't spoken since I'd left early that night, which wasn't unusual. Our relationship had been professionally cordial for years, the kind of distant politeness you maintain with colleagues you don't particularly like but have to work with. Danny? Hey, it's Marcus. I glanced at my watch. 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Hey, everything okay? Yeah, everything's fine. Actually, I'm calling with good news. Emma and I are having an engagement party next month. Nothing too crazy, just family and close friends. We'd love for you to be there. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. Family gatherings were already challenging enough, but engagement parties were their own special kind of torture. All the usual dysfunction, amplified by champagne and the need to perform happiness for someone else's big moment. When and where? I asked, already mentally calculating whether I could manufacture a business emergency. November 15th, at the Cherry Creek Country Club. It's a Saturday evening, cocktail attire. Emma's been planning it for weeks. She's really excited to have everyone together. The Cherry Creek Country Club. Of course. The kind of place where my father felt comfortable, where Marcus could show off his success to Denver's legal elite. The kind of place where I'd spend the entire evening explaining why I didn't have a real job. I'll try to make it, I said, which was my standard response to family events. Actually, Danny, I need you to be there. Emma specifically asked me to make sure you'd come. She's been asking about you since dinner, wanted to know more about what you do. That caught my attention. She has... Yeah, it's been pretty persistent, actually. She keeps saying there's something she's not understanding about your work situation. You know how Emma is. Once she gets curious about something, she doesn't let it go. I didn't know how Emma was, though we'd only met a handful of times. She was a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs, the kind of person who could spot inconsistencies in balance sheets from across a conference room. Sharp, methodical, and apparently fixated on my work situation. What did you tell her? The truth, that you dropped out of business school to work with tech companies in Austin, that the family's been worried about your long-term prospects. Standard stuff. Standard stuff. The family narrative they calcified over 6 years into something that felt more real than reality itself. Look, Marcus, I appreciate the invitation, but you know how these things go. Dad starts it on career advice. Mom makes comment about stability, and everyone feels uncomfortable. This is different, Danny. Emma wants to get to know you better. She thinks the family doesn't understand what you're actually doing, and she wants to bridge that gap. The idea of someone wanting to bridge the gap between my two worlds filled me with equal parts hope and terror. What if she dug too deep? What if she connected the dots between Daniel Chun, the investor, and Danny, the family disappointment? I'll be there, I heard myself saying, but I might need to leave early if there's a work emergency. Fair enough. And Danny, maybe dress it up a little. You know how Dad gets about first impressions. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring out at the Austin skyline, trying to process what I just committed to. An engagement party where Emma would be asking questions, where my usual deflections might not work, where the carefully constructed walls between my two lives might finally start to crack. Jennifer knocked on my door with a stack of term sheets that needed review. Everything okay? You look like someone just told you Christmas was canceled. Family stuff, I said, which was my standard explanation for any personal drama that bled into work hours. The infamous Denver family that thinks you're wasting your life? I'd made the mistake of telling Jennifer about my family dynamics during a late-night work session a year ago. She'd been incredulous that anyone could look at my portfolio returns and consider me unsuccessful. They want me to come to my brother's engagement party. The lawyer brother who makes more than most people see in a lifetime? She asked, using air quotes to mock my father's phrasing from our previous conversations. That's the one. And his fiancée is apparently very curious about what I actually do for work. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. Curious how? Curious enough that my brother felt the need to specifically mention it when inviting me. Sounds like someone's about to connect some dots. That was exactly what I was afraid of. For 6 years, I'd managed to keep my two worlds separate through careful omissions and strategic vagueness. I'd never technically lied to my family. I really did work with tech companies. I really did help startups get off the ground. I just left out the part about writing seven-figure checks and having a portfolio worth more than my father's law firm. Maybe it's time, Jennifer said quietly. Maybe it's time to stop letting them think you're failing. I looked at her across my desk, this brilliant woman who commanded respect in every room she entered, who never had to justify her success to anyone. It's complicated, I said. It's only complicated because you're making it complicated. You're one of the most successful investors in Austin. You created more value in 6 years than most people create in their entire careers. Why are you still pretending to be something you're not? The question hung in the air between us, unanswered because I wasn't sure I knew the answer myself. Fear, maybe. Pride. The strange comfort that came from being underestimated. Or maybe I was just terrified that even if they knew the truth, they still wouldn't be proud of me. The weeks leading up to the engagement party felt like preparing for a military campaign. I found myself obsessing over details that had never mattered before. What to wear, what to say, how to navigate the inevitable questions about my life without either lying or revealing the whole truth. I was in my walk-in closet, staring at a row of suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, when I realized how ridiculous the situation had become. I owned custom-made Italian suits that I wore to board meetings with Fortune 500 CEOs, but I was worried about impressing people who thought I was a failure. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Looking forward to seeing you at the party. Marcus mentioned you work with startups. I'd love to hear more about it. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decode the subtext. Was this casual curiosity or professional interest? Did she suspect something, or was she just being polite? I called Jennifer, even though it was after business hours. Let me guess, she said before I could speak. You're spiraling about the engagement party. I got a text from the fiancée. She wants to talk about my work. Shocking. A Goldman Sachs analyst wants to discuss business with someone in her future family. Stop the presses. You don't understand. If she starts asking detailed questions, then you tell her the truth. Novel concept, I know. I walked to my window, looking out over Lady Bird Lake, where paddle boarders were catching the last light of the day. What if telling the truth changes everything? What if it does? Would that be so terrible? The question caught me off guard. Would it be terrible if my family knew the truth? Would it be terrible if they suddenly respected my choices? If they stopped seeing me as the black sheep who'd never figured his life out? I've been the disappointment for so long. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else to them. I admitted, that's the saddest thing you've ever said to me. She was right, and we both knew it. I'd become so comfortable with being underestimated that the prospect of being seen clearly felt almost threatening. Tell me about Goldman Sachs, I said, changing the subject to something I could control. What would someone like Emma know about venture capital? Everything. Goldman has one of the biggest private equity arms in the world. She'd definitely know the major players, the big exits, the successful funds. If she's as sharp as you say she is, she'd probably recognize your name if she thought to connect it. My stomach dropped. I'd been featured in enough industry publications that anyone who followed venture capital closely would know Daniel Chen. I'd been careful to avoid major media outlets, but TechCrunch, VentureBeat, and Forbes had all written about my investments. If Emma was the type of person who read financial news religiously, I need to know what she knows, I said, pacing around my living room. Or you could just have an honest conversation with your future sister-in-law, like a normal person. But I wasn't ready for normal. Not yet. Instead, I spent the next hour researching Emma's background online. LinkedIn told me she was a VP in Goldman's technology, media, and telecommunications group. Her education was impressive. Harvard undergrad, Wharton MBA. Her LinkedIn post showed someone who followed venture capital trends closely, who had opinions about emerging technologies and market valuations. In other words, Exactly the kind of person who would recognize my name if she bothered to look. I found myself spiraling through scenarios. What if she'd already figured it out? What if the engagement party was some kind of intervention? A family ambush designed to force me into honesty? What if Marcus had asked her to investigate me? By Thursday, I was considering hiring a crisis management firm. "You've officially lost your mind," Jennifer said when I mentioned it during our morning briefing. "You're talking about hiring professionals to help you hide your success from your own family." It's not about hiding success. It's about managing expectations. Whose expectations? Theirs or yours? The question hit harder than I expected. Was I protecting them from disappointment, or was I protecting myself from their judgment? Was I worried they'd be upset that I'd been lying, or was I worried they'd be upset about what my success said about their assumptions? What if they're angry that I didn't tell them? I asked, what if they're proud of what you've accomplished? Pride. It was such a foreign concept when it came to my family that I almost couldn't process it. When was the last time my father had been proud of me? When was the last time my mother had bragged about my achievements to her friends? They don't know how to be proud of something they don't understand. I said, then help them understand. That afternoon, I made a decision. I called my stylist and asked her to help me put together an outfit that struck the right balance, successful enough to command respect, understated enough not to raise too many questions. I scheduled a haircut with the guy who usually prepared me for investor meetings. I even hired a car service to drive me to Denver, reasoning that showing up in my Tesla Model S might prompt questions I wasn't ready to answer. But as the engagement party approached, I realized I was preparing for the wrong battle. The real conflict wasn't going to be about clothes or cars or carefully crafted explanations. The real conflict was going to be about who I was willing to be in a room full of people who thought they already knew me. The Cherry Creek Country Club looked exactly like every other exclusive venue my family favored. Mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, and a kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. I arrived fashionably late, hoping to blend into the crowd and avoid the inevitable round of introductions and explanations. The strategy backfired immediately. "Danny." My mother's voice cut across the cocktail chatter as she approached with Emma in tow. "There you are. Emma's been asking about you all evening." Emma looked stunning in a navy dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, her Goldman Sachs salary evident in every detail from her jewelry to her perfectly styled hair. But it was her eyes that caught my attention, intelligent and curious, with the kind of focused intensity one recognized from boardrooms and pitch meetings. "Daniel," she said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "I'm so glad you made it. Marcus wasn't sure you'd be able to get away from work." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, though we all knew that was probably a lie. "Your mother was just telling me about your work with technology companies. It sounds fascinating." I felt that familiar internal alarm system activate. My mother knew almost nothing about my actual work, which meant Emma was fishing for information with a nearly empty hook. "It keeps me busy," I said, going for casual deflection. "I bet it does. The tech sector has been incredible these past few years. So much innovation, so much capital flowing into early-stage companies." She paused, studying my reaction. I work in tech investment banking at Goldman, so I have a front-row seat to all the excitement. There it was, the professional connection I'd been dreading. Emma wasn't just curious. She was informed, potentially very informed. "That must be interesting work," I said carefully. "It is, especially when you get to see companies grow from startup to IPO. Some of the early investors in our clients have made incredible returns." Another pause, another studying look. "I imagine you see some of that from the operational side." The operational side. She was probing, trying to understand my exact role without asking directly. It was the kind of careful questioning I'd expect from someone who'd been trained to extract information from reluctant sources. My father chose that moment to join our conversation, carrying his trademark scotch and wearing his trademark expression of mild disappointment. "Daniel, I see you've met Emma. She's been asking about your career path." The way he said career path made it sound like a terminal illness. I was just explaining to Daniel how impressive the tech sector has been. Emma said diplomatically, So much opportunity for people with the right instincts. Instincts, my father repeated with a slight smile. That's certainly one way to put it. Daniel's always been more of a dreamer than a planner. We keep hoping he'll find something with more stability. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the same embarrassment I'd been carrying since I was 20, and told my family I was dropping out of business school. 6 years later, and the script hadn't changed, but Emma's expression had changed. The polite interest was replaced by something sharper, more focused. She was looking between my father and me like she was watching a puzzle solve itself in real time. Stability is overrated, she said quietly. Some of the most successful people I know took risks that seemed crazy to their families. My father laughed, the kind of condescending chuckle that had defined my childhood. Emma, you work for Goldman Sachs. That's the definition of stability. Daniel works with, well, it's never been entirely clear what Daniel does. I help startups raise capital. I said, the words coming out more defensively than I'd intended. Ah, Emma said, and there was something in her tone that made my stomach drop. Capital raising. That's a specialized field. She knew. I could see it in her eyes, the moment of recognition. She was looking at me like she was seeing me clearly for the first time, and I had no idea whether that terrified me or relieved me. Very specialized, my father agreed, though his tone suggested he thought it was about as specialized as making sandwiches. Daniel's always been good with computers, so I suppose it's natural he'd end up in that world. Good with computers, Emma repeated, and I caught the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth. Daniel, could I steal you for a moment? I'd love to get your thoughts on something. Before I could object, she was guiding me away from my parents toward a quieter corner of the room. My heart was pounding like I was about to give the most important pitch of my life. So, she said once we were alone, how long have you been letting your family think you're struggling? The question hit me like a physical blow. No pretense, no careful probing. Just direct confrontation from someone who'd clearly figured out that nothing about this situation was what it seemed. I don't know what you mean, I said, though we both knew it was a lie. Emma pulled out her phone and showed me a screen I recognized immediately. A TechCrunch article from 6 months ago with the headline, "The Mysterious Daniel Chun. Austin's most successful angel investor stays out of the spotlight." "You're him, aren't you?" she said quietly. The Daniel Chun who backed 3 unicorns before he turned 25. The investor who everyone in Silicon Valley wants to meet, but no one can get a meeting with. I stared at the article, at the carefully cropped photo that showed just enough of my face to be recognizable, if you knew where to look. The game was over. How long have you known? I asked. I suspected at dinner 3 weeks ago. You don't live like someone who's struggling. Your clothes, your watch, the way you carry yourself. But I wasn't sure until tonight, when your father started talking about your lack of stability. She laughed softly. The irony was too perfect. I had to check. I looked across the room at my family, mingling and laughing, and completely unaware that their fundamental understanding of me was about to change forever. Are you going to tell them? I asked. Emma studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something like sympathy in her expression. That depends, she said. Are you going to tell me why you've been letting them believe you're a failure when you're actually one of the most successful people in this room? Why? Emma asked again, her voice gentle but insistent. Why would you let your family think you're struggling when you're clearly not? I looked around the country club, at the familiar faces of aunts and uncles and family friends who'd watched me grow up, who'd witnessed my transformation from promising young man to family disappointment. The weight of 6 years of deception felt suddenly unbearable. Because it was easier, I said finally. Because once they decided I was a failure, it became simpler to let them believe it than to try to change their minds. But you're not a failure. You're the opposite of failure. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You don't understand how my family works. My father measures success in terms he can understand. Law degrees, corporate jobs, traditional career paths. My brother makes partner at his firm. That's success. My sister designs buildings. That's success. I write checks to college dropouts with crazy ideas. And to him, that looks like throwing money away. But you're not throwing money away. You're creating value. You're building the future. Try explaining that to a man who thinks the internet is still a fad. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. So you've been hiding your success to avoid their judgment? I've been hiding my success to avoid their confusion. They won't understand it, and I'd have to explain venture capital and startup ecosystems, and why I think a 22-year-old with an AI algorithm is worth betting 7 figures on. It would be exhausting. More exhausting than pretending to be something you're not. The question hung between us like a challenge. Was it more exhausting? I'd become so accustomed to the dual identity that I'd stopped considering the emotional cost of maintaining it. What happens when I tell them? I asked, what happens when they realize I've been lying for 6 years? You haven't been lying. You've been protecting yourself. Same thing in their eyes. Emma set down her champagne glass and turned to face me fully. Daniel, can I tell you what I see when I look at your family dynamics? I nodded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. I see a family that loves you but doesn't understand you. I see parents who are genuinely worried about your future because they can't see what you're building. And I see you punishing them for their misunderstanding by withholding the truth that would put their minds at ease. The words hit harder than I expected. Punishing them? Maybe not consciously. But think about it. Every family dinner where they worry about your finances, every conversation where they try to give you career advice, every moment they spend feeling like they failed as parents because their son can't seem to get his life together. You could end all of that tomorrow. I felt something crack inside my chest, a wall I'd built so carefully that I'd forgotten it was there. What if they're angry that I didn't tell them sooner? What if they're relieved that you're okay? Across the room, Marcus was giving a toast, thanking everyone for coming to celebrate his engagement. I watched my parents' faces as they listened to their successful son talk about building a life with a wonderful woman, and I saw the pride there, the uncomplicated joy of parents watching their child thrive. When was the last time they'd looked at me that way? I don't know how to tell them. I admitted. Emma smiled, and for the first time since she'd figured out my secret, I saw warmth instead of curiosity in her expression. You don't have to tell them everything at once, but maybe you could start by telling them the truth about what you actually do, which is, you invest in companies that change the world. You help brilliant people turn their ideas into reality. You've created thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in value. She paused. You're exactly what they raised you to be, someone who makes a difference. The toast was ending, and people were starting to mingle again. I could see my mother scanning the room, probably looking for me so she could introduce me to someone else who would ask what I did for work. They're going to have questions, I said. Of course they are. That's what families do. They're going to want to understand the business, then help them understand. They might be proud of me. Emma laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound I'd heard from her all evening. That's the point, Daniel. That's exactly the point. I took a deep breath, tasting possibility for the first time in years. What would it feel like to walk into a family dinner without dreading the inevitable questions about my career? What would it feel like to have my parents brag about me to their friends instead of making excuses? What would it feel like to stop being ashamed of my own success? Will you help me? I asked. When I tell them, I mean, you understand the business better than they will. You could help translate. I'd be honored to help, she said. But Daniel, they don't need to understand every detail of venture capital to be proud of what you've accomplished. They just need to understand that you're happy and successful and building something meaningful. Are those things true? The question surprised both of us. I had a minute to ask it, hadn't even realized I was thinking it. Are you happy? She asked gently. I looked around the room again, at the family that had shaped me, at the life I'd built in secret, at the woman who'd seen through my carefully constructed facade in a matter of weeks. I think I could be, I said, and for the first time in 6 years, I actually believed it. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. After the engagement party wound down, my parents invited Emma and Marcus back to the house for coffee and what my mother called a proper chat. I found myself sitting in the same living room where I'd grown up, surrounded by family photos that chronicle my transformation from promising child to disappointment. Emma, tell us about your work. My mother said, settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of coffee. Goldman Sachs must be so exciting. Emma glanced at me before answering, a silent question in her eyes. I gave her the smallest nod, my heart pounding. It is exciting, she said. I work with technology companies, helping them raise capital and go public. It's fascinating to see how innovation transforms into investment opportunities. My father leaned forward with interest. That must give you good insight into which companies are worth betting on. It does. Though some of the best investors I've met have an instinct that goes beyond traditional analysis. They see potential where others see risk. She was setting the stage, I realized, creating an opening for the conversation we'd agreed needed to happen. Like venture capitalists? Marcus asked. Exactly like venture capitalists. Some of them are incredibly successful, writing seven-figure checks to startups that become billion-dollar companies. My mother made a dismissive sound. That sounds like gambling to me. How can anyone know which companies will succeed? It's not gambling when you understand the market, Emma said carefully. The best investors have deep expertise in their sectors. They understand technology trends, market dynamics, and most importantly, they can recognize exceptional founders. Still sounds risky, my father said. I prefer investments I can understand. Real estate, established companies, bonds. Something stable. I felt the familiar frustration rising in my chest. This was exactly why I never tried to explain my work to them. They approached risk from a completely different perspective, valued security over opportunity. But Emma wasn't giving up. Daniel, she said, turning to me with that encouraging smile, you work with startups. What's your perspective on the risk-reward equation? The room went quiet. My parents looked at me with that familiar mixture of polite interest and low expectations. Marcus seemed genuinely curious. Emma was watching me with eyes that said, "This is your moment." It's not really about risk, I said slowly. It's about recognizing patterns. When you've seen enough startups, you start to understand what separates the companies that scale from the ones that fail. What kind of patterns? My father asked, and I was surprised to hear genuine interest in his voice. Team dynamics, market timing, product market fit. You learn to spot founders who have the vision and persistence to build something lasting. And you advise these companies? My mother asked. This was it, the moment where I could continue the comfortable lie or step into the truth. I invest in them, I said quietly. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Invest how? My father asked. I looked at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. I write checks, usually between $1 and $10 million, depending on the company and the stage. My mother's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. Million? With an M? Yes. Where do you get that kind of money? Marcus asked, and his voice had changed from casual curiosity to sharp attention. I've been successful, I said simply. My first few investments did well, and I reinvested the returns. It snowballed over the past 6 years. My father was staring at me like I just told him I was secretly an astronaut. Daniel, how successful are we talking about? Emma spoke up gently. Your son is one of the most respected angel investors in Austin. He's backed 3 companies that are now worth over $1 billion each. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Billion, my mother whispered. His portfolio is worth more than most venture capital funds, Emma continued. He's featured regularly in industry publications. Tech grunts called him Austin's most successful mystery investor. Mystery investor? Marcus asked. I finally found my voice. I prefer to stay out of the spotlight. I don't do a lot of interviews or public appearances. I let the companies I invest in get the attention. My father set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. You're telling me that while we've been worried about your financial stability, you've been, what? A millionaire? Significantly more than that, I admitted. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see my parents processing this information, try to reconcile the son they thought they knew with the reality Emma was presenting. Why? My mother asked finally, and her voice was small and hurt. Why didn't you tell us? This was a question I'd been dreading, the one I'd been avoiding for 6 years. Because I was afraid you wouldn't understand, I said. Because Every time I tried to explain what I was doing, you dismiss it as playing around on computers, because it was easier to let you think I was struggling than to try to convince you that what I was building was real. We would have been proud of you, my father said, and his voice was thick with emotion I'd rarely heard from him. Would you? Or would you have spent 6 years trying to convince me to get a real job? The accusation hung between us, and I immediately regretted it. But my father didn't get angry. Instead, he looked at me with something that might have been understanding. You're probably right, he said quietly. We probably would have. We've spent so long worrying about your future that we never stopped to consider you might have it figured out better than we did. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she tried to hide behind her coffee cup. All those dinners, all those times we lectured you about responsibility and planning for the future. I know, Mom. We must have seemed so foolish to you. Not foolish, just worried about the wrong things. Emma reached over and squeezed my hand. Maybe we should talk about the right things, she said. Like the fact that Daniel has created something remarkable. Like the fact that he's helping shape the future of technology. Like the fact that your son is exactly the kind of person you raise him to be. Someone who takes calculated risks to build something meaningful. Marcus was shaking his head in amazement. Jesus, Danny. All this time, we thought you were the family screw-up, and you were actually what? Actually the most successful person in the room. The words hit me like a physical force. For 6 years, I'd been the cautionary tale, the example of wasted potential. Now, suddenly, I was something else entirely. I'm still the same person, I said. I have a different job than you thought. No, my father said firmly. You're not the same person. You're the person we always hoped you become, but we were too narrow-minded to recognize it. He stood up and crossed the room, and for a moment I thought he was going to leave. Instead, he sat down next to me and put his hand on my shoulder. I owe you an apology, he said. We all do. We spent 6 years making you feel like a disappointment when you were actually building an empire. It's not an empire, Dad. It's just business. Don't diminish what you've accomplished, Emma said firmly. You've built something extraordinary. Own it. I looked around the room at the faces of my family. Really looked at them for the first time in years. Instead of disappointment or confusion, I saw pride, wonder, love that had been there all along, but had been obscured by misunderstanding. There's something else, I said, because I was tired of secrets. The studio apartment Marcus mentioned? I don't live there anymore. I have a penthouse in Austin. The old car? I drive a Tesla. The financial struggles you've been worried about, they ended about 5 years ago. My mother laughed through her tears. Is there anything else you haven't told us? I thought about it. Forbes wants to do a profile. I've been avoiding it, but maybe it's time. Maybe it is. My father said, we'd like to read it. And for the first time in 6 years, I believe they actually would. The weeks following the engagement party felt like living in an alternate universe. Instead of dreading phone calls from my family, I found myself looking forward to them. Instead of deflecting questions about my work, I was fielding genuine curiosity about venture capital, startup ecosystems, and the companies I was backing. The transformation wasn't immediate or seamless. My parents had completely recalibrated their understanding of my life, and that came with its own complications. So when you said you were having cash flow problems last year, my mother said during one of our new weekly phone calls, I was having a temporary liquidity issue while waiting for a major exit. I explained patiently. The company got acquired 3 months later. I wasn't actually broke, Mom. But you sounded so stressed about money. I was stressed about having too much tied up in illiquid investments. It's a different problem than the one you thought I had. These conversations were happening regularly now. Moments where my family would remember something I'd said or done in the past 6 years and realize they completely misunderstood the context. It was like watching them solve a puzzle in reverse, taking apart assumptions they'd built over years of incomplete information. Marcus called me on a Thursday evening, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Danny, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Okay, That time 2 years ago when Dad was in the hospital and you offered to help with the medical bills. I remembered. My father had needed emergency surgery, and insurance coverage had been complicated. I quietly offered to handle any expenses that weren't covered, but my parents had declined, insisting they could manage on their own. You were offering to pay for everything, weren't you? Marcus continued. The whole bill, not just Chip and a few $100s. I was offering to help however they needed. I said, carefully, Danny, that hospital bill was over $60,000. I know. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a long moment. They turned down $60,000 because they thought you couldn't afford it. They turned it down because they're proud people who don't like accepting help. No, they turned it down because they thought accepting money from you would put you in financial jeopardy. Mom told Emma she was worried you'd have to take out loans or something. The irony was almost painful. My parents had stressed about medical bills I could have covered with pocket change, all because they thought I was struggling financially. Are there other times? Marcus asked. Other times when you offered help and we misunderstood? I thought about Christmas gifts I wanted to give, but held back because they would have seemed too expensive for my supposed budget. Family vacations I could have funded, but never offered to pay for. The down payment I could have given Marcus for his Manhattan apartment. The student loans I could have helped Sarah pay off. A few, I said. We're idiots. Marcus said flatly. You're not idiots. You were working with incomplete information. Information you could have given us at any time. He wasn't wrong, but the blame wasn't entirely one-sided either. Information you never asked for. Information you assumed you didn't need because you'd already decided what my story was. It was a fair point, and we both knew it. My family had constructed a narrative about my life, and then filtered everything through that lens. But I'd enabled that narrative by never challenging it directly. Things are going to be different now, Marcus said. Are they? They have to be. Emma's been educating Mom and Dad about venture capital. She printed out some of your TechCrunch interviews and made them read them. Dad's been telling everyone at his firm that his son is a successful investor. The image of my father bragging about me to his law partners was so foreign I almost couldn't process it. How's that going over? Better than you'd think. Apparently half the partners have been asking him for investment advice. They think you might want to look at their portfolios. I laughed to spite myself. Tell them I don't do traditional investment management. I already did. But Dad's loving the attention. I think he's proud of having something to brag about. Something to brag about. For 6 years, I've been the son my parents didn't know how to explain to their friends. Now, suddenly, I was the son they couldn't stop talking about. Emma wants to take you to lunch next week, Marcus continued. She's got some ideas about portfolio companies that might benefit from Goldman's services. She wants to pitch me? She wants to collaborate with you. There's a difference. And I was slowly learning to recognize it. The difference between people who wanted something from me and people who wanted to work with me. The difference between being seen as a resource and being seen as a partner. I'd like that, I said, and I meant it. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the conversation with Emma that had started all of this. She'd asked me why I was hiding my success, and I'd given her all the logical reasons. Family dynamics, mismatched expectations, the comfort being underestimated. But sitting in my Austin penthouse, looking out over a city where I commanded respect and wielded influence, I realized there had been something else. Something deeper and more complicated than simple family dysfunction. I'd been hiding my success because I wasn't sure I deserved it. The thought hit me like a revelation. For 6 years, I've been carrying the secret guilt that maybe my family was right. Maybe I was just lucky. Maybe I was playing an elaborate game that would eventually collapse, revealing me to be exactly the failure they thought I was. Keeping them in the dark had protected me from their potential judgment, but it had also protected me from having to own my achievements. If they didn't know I was successful, I didn't have to grapple with whether I'd earned that success or simply stumbled into it. But Emma's questions had forced me to confront the truth. I had earned it. Every investment decision, every calculated risk, every late night spent evaluating startups and founders, it had all been real work that created real value. I was successful because I was good at what I did, not because I was lucky. For the first time in 6 years, I felt like I could finally start believing it. 6 months after the engagement party, I found myself back in the same Cherry Creek Country Club, but this time the dynamics were completely different. Marcus and Emma's wedding was a much larger affair than their engagement party, with over 200 guests and all the formality that came with two successful careers colliding in matrimony. I was standing at the bar, wearing a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than my father's first car, when I overheard a conversation that made me smile. "That's Daniel Chun," one of my father's law partners was saying to his wife. "Remember I told you about him? He's the one who invested in that company that got bought by Google for $3 billion. "Richard's son?" the woman asked, looking impressed. "The one who lives in Austin?" "That's the one. Richard's been showing everyone the Forbes article. His son made the 30 under 30-foot list for venture capital. I had indeed made the Forbes list, finally agreeing to the profile after Emma's gentle but persistent encouragement. The article had been more thorough than I'd expected, detailing not just my investment track record, but also my philosophy about backing founders who were building solutions to real problems. My parents had framed the magazine cover. "Daniel." I turned to find Emma approaching in her wedding dress, a vision in silk and lace that somehow managed to be both elegant and approachable. Marriage suited her. There was a glow about her that went beyond professional success. "You look incredible," I told her, meaning it completely. "Thank you. And thank you for the wedding gift. A honeymoon in New Zealand is incredibly generous." I'd insisted on paying for their 2-week trip, partly because I could afford it and partly because I'd missed years of being the kind of brother and son who could do generous things without it being remarkable. "It's nothing," I said, which was true from a financial perspective, but not entirely accurate from an emotional one. "It's not nothing to us. Marcus has been planning the itinerary for months." She paused, studying my face with that analytical look I'd come to recognize and appreciate. "How are you doing with all this?" she asked. "The attention, the family dynamic changes. Everything being different?" It was a good question. The past 6 months had been a masterclass in identity adjustment. I'd gone from being the family disappointment to being the family success story, and that shift had required recalibrating relationships that had been frozen in place for years. "It's been an adjustment," I admitted. "Good, but strange. I'm still getting used to Dad asking my opinion about things instead of giving me advice I don't need. He's proud of you. They all are." "I know. That's the strange part. I spent so long believing they couldn't be proud of something they didn't understand that I never considered they might learn to understand it." Emma smiled. "People are more adaptable than we give them credit for. Your parents love you. They just needed help translating that love into your language. And you provided the translation. I provided the bridge. You did the hard work of crossing it." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus appearing at Emma's elbow, looking slightly overwhelmed by the logistics of managing a large wedding. "There you are," he said to Emma. "Your grandmother is looking for you, and the photographer wants to do some shots before the ceremony starts." Emma squeezed my arm. "We'll talk more at the reception. I want to hear about that AI company you're evaluating." As she walked away, Marcus and I found ourselves alone for the first time in months. The old awkwardness was gone, replaced by something that felt remarkably like actual brotherhood. "Nervous?" I asked. "Terrified," he admitted, "but the good kind of terrified. Emma's incredible, Danny. I can't believe she said yes." "She can't believe you asked," I replied, which was true. Emma had confided to me during one of our regular lunch meetings that she'd been dropping hints about marriage for months before Marcus finally worked up the courage to propose. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said, "I was always jealous of you growing up." That caught me completely off guard. "Jealous? Of what?" "Your freedom, your willingness to take risks. I've always done exactly what was expected of me. Good grades, law school, prestigious firm, sensible career track. You just did your own thing. Even when everyone thought you were failing, you kept doing what you believed in." I stared at my brother, trying to process this revelation. "I thought you agreed with Mom and Dad. I thought you saw me as irresponsible." "I did sometimes, but I also envied your courage. It takes guts to disappoint your family in service of your own vision. I wasn't trying to disappoint anyone. I know that now. But even if you had been, there's something admirable about being willing to be misunderstood if that's the price of being authentic. The words hit me harder than I'd expected. For 6 years, I'd seen my family's misunderstanding as a failure of communication. But Marcus was reframing it as something else entirely, a choice to prioritize my own path over their approval. I never thought about it that way. I said, Emma helped me see it. She said you were protecting something precious by keeping it private. She said some people share their dreams too early and let other people's doubts kill them before they have a chance to grow. It was a generous interpretation of what had been, at least partly, cowardice and pride. But maybe generosity was what families were supposed to offer each other. The benefit of the doubt, the assumption of good intentions, the space to grow into better versions of themselves. I'm glad you found her, I said. Emma's good for all of us. She is. And Danny, I'm glad you found your thing too. I'm glad you're successful. But more than that, I'm glad you're happy. I am happy, I said, and realized it was completely true. The ceremony was beautiful, officiated by one of Emma's law school professors in the club's garden overlooking the Denver skyline. I sat with my parents, watching my brother promise to love and support a woman who had fundamentally changed our family dynamic simply by asking the right questions. During the reception, I found myself at a table with several of Emma's Goldman Sachs colleagues, discussing market trends and investment opportunities with the kind of professional respect I'd never experienced at family gatherings. These were conversations between equals, not lectures from concerned relatives. Daniel, one of them said, I read your Forbes interview. The point you made about investing in problems rather than solutions was brilliant. Thank you. Are you taking new LPs? We have clients who might be interested in your next fund. The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on individual investments that I hadn't seriously considered raising a formal fund. But as the conversation continued, I found myself genuinely intrigued by the possibility. Later, as the evening wound down, I found myself on the club's terrace with my parents, watching Denver's lights twinkle in the distance. This has been a wonderful day, my mother said, leaning against my father's shoulder with the contentment of parents who had successfully launched both their children into happy, productive lives. It has, I agreed. Daniel, my father said, I owe you another apology. Dad, we've been through this. No, let me finish. I've been thinking about the past 6 years, about all the conversations we had about your future, all the advice I gave you that you didn't need. I was so focused on my own definition of success that I couldn't see you were creating your own. He paused, looking out over the city where he'd built his legal career, where he'd raised his family, where he'd learned to measure success in terms that made sense to him. I'm proud of the work I've done, he continued. I've helped people, built something meaningful. But what you've done, the companies you've backed, the jobs you've helped create, the innovations you've funded, that's a different kind of legacy. It's not better or worse, Dad. It's just different. It's better, he said firmly. Not because the numbers are bigger, but because you had the courage to build something new instead of just following a path someone else laid out. My mother reached over and took my hand. We love you, Daniel. We've always loved you. We just didn't know how to show it in a way that made sense to you. You're showing it now, I said, and they were, in their questions about my work, their pride in my achievements, their willingness to learn about a world they'd never understood. In my father's bragging to his colleagues and my mother's framed magazine cover, in their acceptance of the son they'd raised, even when he'd grown up to be someone they'd never expected, as we stood there together, watching the city lights and sharing the comfortable silence of a family that had finally learned to see each other clearly, I realized that Emma had been right about something else. People really were more adaptable than we gave them credit for, including me. 1 year later, I was back in Denver for Thanksgiving, but this time the family dynamics were so different they felt almost unrecognizable. Instead of dreading the inevitable questions about my career, I was fielding requests for investment advice from uncles, cousins, and family friends who'd heard about my success through the Denver social network. Daniel, I've got this friend with a restaurant concept. My Uncle Jim said over pre-dinner cocktails. Revolutionary approach to fast casual dining. Interested? I don't typically invest in restaurants, Uncle Jim. I replied, trying to be diplomatic. The margins are tough and scalability is challenging. But you invested in that food delivery company, right? The one that got bought by DoorDash. He was referring to a logistics startup I'd backed 2 years ago that had indeed been acquired, though it had been focused on supply chain optimization rather than restaurant operations. The distinction mattered. But explaining it would require a conversation about business models that would probably lose his interest. Different business model, I said simply, but I'd be happy to look at the pitch deck if your friend puts one together. This was my life now. Being seen as a family's connection to the world of high-stakes investment, the person who might be able to turn someone's business idea into the next big thing. It was flattering and occasionally overwhelming, but it was infinitely better than being seen as a cautionary tale. Emma found me in the kitchen during dinner prep, where I retreated to help my mother with the traditional chaos of cooking for 15 people. "How are you handling all the attention?" she asked, taking over mashing duties from my mother, who was orchestrating the meal with the precision of a military campaign. "It's better than being ignored," I said, stirring gravy and trying not to let it clump. Though I'm starting to understand why some investors become reclusive. Everyone wants to pitch you something. "Welcome to having money and influence," Emma said with a laugh. "Marcus gets pitched legal services at cocktail parties now. Success makes you a target for everyone who thinks they're one conversation away from changing their life." "Speaking of which," I said, lowering my voice so my mother couldn't hear, "are you serious about the fun idea we discussed?" Over the past year, Emma and I had developed a genuine friendship built around our shared understanding of finance and investment. She'd been encouraging me to consider raising a formal venture capital fund rather than continuing to invest as an individual angel investor. Completely serious. You've got the track record, the deal flow, and the reputation. A Chun Capital Fund could easily raise $50 to $100 million for a first close. The numbers were staggering to contemplate, even for someone who'd grown comfortable with large-scale investments. Managing other people's money came with different responsibilities and pressures than investing my own capital. The regulatory complexity alone would be enormous, I said. That's what lawyers are for. Marcus has been researching fund formation law in his spare time. He's practically begging to help with the legal work. I looked through the kitchen doorway into the dining room, where Marcus was setting the table and chatting with our cousins about their various career updates. A year ago, the idea of working closely with my brother on a business venture would have seemed impossible. Now it felt natural, even appealing. What would be different about a Chin Capital Fund? I asked, what would make it worth the hassle? Emma paused in her mashing, considering the question seriously. Your investment philosophy. You don't just look at market opportunity or technical innovation. You look at founders who are solving problems they personally understand. That's rare in VC. She was right. My most successful investments had been in companies started by people who had lived with the problems they were trying to solve. The logistics startup founded by a former restaurant manager who'd struggled with supply chain inefficiencies. The cybersecurity company started by a system administrator who'd been hacked. The healthcare platform created by a doctor frustrated with electronic medical records. Pattern recognition, I said. Exactly. You recognize patterns that other investors miss because you understand that the best solutions come from people who have felt the pain personally. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. The Meridian AI acquisition is official. Your 12% stake is worth $47 million. Congratulations. I showed Emma the message, and she whistled softly. That's your third exit this year over $20 million, she said. You're running out of reasons not to start a fund. She was right, though the success still felt surreal sometimes. 3 years ago, Kevin and his co-founders had been 3 kids in a WeWork space with a brilliant idea and no money. Now they were millionaires. Their AI platform was being integrated into one of the world's largest financial services companies, and I'd made more money on the deal than my father's law firm generated in a good year. Dinner, my mother called, and the extended family began the familiar migration to the dining room. As we gathered around the expanded table that could barely fit everyone, I found myself looking at faces that had become genuinely welcoming over the past year. My cousin Sarah's husband asked thoughtful questions about startup valuations. My Aunt Patricia wanted to understand how artificial intelligence might impact her real estate business. Even my grandfather, approaching 90 and traditionally skeptical of anything involving computers, had started following Tesla's stock price because Daniel says electric cars are the future. My father stood to give a traditional Thanksgiving toast, a ritual that had remained unchanged throughout my childhood. This year, I'm thankful for family, he began, for health, for the opportunities we've been given to build meaningful lives. He paused, looking around the table with a satisfied expression of a patriarch who had successfully guided his children into adulthood. I'm especially thankful for the reminder that success comes in many forms, and that sometimes the people we worry about most are the ones who have everything figured out better than we do. His eyes met mine across the table, and I saw pride there, unmistakable and uncomplicated. To Daniel, he continued, raising his wine glass, who taught us that taking risks in service of your vision isn't reckless, it's courageous. The toast caught me completely off guard. For 26 years, family toasts have been generic expressions of gratitude. I'd never been singled out for anything beyond my birthday. To Daniel, the table echoed, and I felt that familiar crack in my chest, the place where years of disappointment had been replaced by something I was still learning to recognize as belonging. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the family had settled into the traditional post-dinner lethargy, I found myself on the back porch with my father, watching the Denver sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. That was quite a toast, I said. It was overdue, he replied. I've spent a lot of time this year thinking about the advice I gave you over the years, the pressure I put on you to follow a conventional path. You were trying to help. I was trying to protect you from failure. But I was so focused on avoiding failure that I couldn't see you were building something extraordinary. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes down the tree-lined street, where I'd grown up. Emma thinks I should start a venture capital fund. I said, what do you think? I think it's terrifying and exciting and probably inevitable. My father smiled. That sounds like the kind of decision you've gotten good at making. He was right. Over the past 6 years, I'd learned to be comfortable with decisions that scared me, with opportunities that required betting on uncertain outcomes. Starting a fund would be the natural evolution of everything I'd been building. Will you help me think through it? I asked. Not the investment side. I've got that covered. But the business structure, the legal implications, the regulatory requirements. I'd be honored to help, he said, and I could hear the genuine pleasure in his voice. Though you might want to hire Marcus to handle the actual legal work. He's been studying fund formation law like it's his religion. Because Emma asked him to? Because he wants to be part of what you're building. Because he's proud of his little brother and wants to help however he can. The words hit me with unexpected force. For most of our lives, I've been the brother who needed help, who couldn't quite get his act together, who required guidance and concern. The idea of Marcus wanting to be part of my success felt like a fundamental reordering of our relationship. I never expected this. I said, what? Success? Acceptance. Understanding. The chance to be proud of what I built instead of defensive about it. My father nodded slowly. You know what I've learned this year? We raised you to be independent, to think for yourself, to build something meaningful. But when you actually did those things, we panicked because they looked different from what we expected. And now I realize that everything we hoped you became, we just didn't recognize it because it was wrapped in unfamiliar packaging. As the last light faded from the sky, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and thrilling. I'm going to do it, I said. The fund. Shun Capital. I'm going to build something that can outlast individual investments. Something that can back hundreds of founders instead of dozens. That sounds exactly right, my father said. And Daniel, your mother and I would be honored to be your first investors. The offer surprised me. Dad, you don't have to. We want to, not because you need our money, but because we want to be part of what you're building. We want to bet on you the way you've been betting on others. I looked at this man who had shaped my understanding of work and responsibility, who had worried about my future for so long that he'd forgotten to see my present, who was now offering to trust me with his retirement savings. Okay, I said, let's build something together. And as we sat there planning the future at Chin Capital, I realized that Emma had been wrong about one thing. The real bridge between my two worlds hadn't been her translation of venture capital concepts or her patient explanations of startup ecosystems. The real bridge had been time. Time for my family to see that their son had grown into exactly the kind of man they'd raised him to be, even if the path had looked nothing like what they'd expected. Time, and the courage to finally let them see who I really was.